Hello neighbor, I'm Robert Burns and welcome back to the third and final installment of the Brett Tingle civil trial against the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission. Now this is the final installment, but I will make a text update once the jury has rendered its decision, which had better be a big goose egg, because I can tell you that if it is not, little Louisiana will become the absolute laughing stock of the nation, and I have no doubt that the national media will pounce upon any judgment of any magnitude that is awarded to the plaintiff in this case, given the circumstances which we've already given to you previously. And I will say this, in the previous conclusion of the second installment, I explained that Judge DeGravels was very unhappy, to say the least, and after having slept on it, he returned to his normal calm and very polite mannerisms, which had been exhibited throughout the trial until I guess he had bottled it all up, and he did explode on Thursday evening. So if you're an attorney who's never argued before Judge DeGravels, my advice to you is, if you give him a timetable, stick to it, or if you're going to run a little bit beyond it, let him know well in advance and smooth it over, because I'm going to tell you right now, when you tell him 2.5 days and you're on 4 days and you're still going, you really don't want to hear what he's going to have to say, trust me. So that's a little friendly advice to the attorneys that may argue before Judge DeGravels in the future. And I will tell you, when he does lose his temper, he loses it, okay? So you don't want to be on the receiving end of that. You know, normally, all through the trial, he had been Mr. Congeniality, and then all of a sudden, bam. So I'm going to make one other quick little notation, and then we'll get straight on into the feature. I want to issue an apology, and I'm smiling as I say it, to Mr. Conkey. I always have to pause and think of that name, but Mr. Conkey, as many of you will recall, I had emphasized his Marine technique, and he is most certainly a Marine, but I also relayed about an encounter that he and I had in the bathroom, and I had said good morning, and I didn't hear a word out of him. Well, what I did not know is that he is extremely hard of hearing in his right ear, and that's the side I was on. So he did not hear me say good morning, and so I apologize, Mr. Conkey. Not that I made an overly huge issue of it, but had I known that, I'd kept my mouth shut, and I hope you will accept my apology in that regard, because I've now been informed that that was the situation, and that he had no idea that I had said good morning. So with those little preliminaries out of the way, the first witness that got called on Friday was Lewis Thompson. He's now with State Police in Albany. I'm not going to harp much on Mr. Thompson other than to say he was another one of these ones that took very liberal use of the Family and Medical Leave Act. Said he had migraines, you know, and he readily admitted he too was looking for another job. These migraines didn't slow him down from doing that, but he couldn't do the work for ATC. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because there was a deadline for federal grants with regard to the FDA, and it needed to be done by the end of August, and all these people are taking this Family and Medical Leave Act because they got the got the reds with Commissioner Hebert, and they didn't meet the deadline, okay? And I want to emphasize one thing. It's been testified to that there was nobody who liked Troy Hebert in that office. I mean, they said pretty much everybody could not stand him, but that, as common sense would tell you, that means you've got a lot of white employees that can't stand him, a lot of black employees that can't stand him, and he did these sorts of things with whites and blacks. But it is kind of interesting how Brett Tingle was able to corral only black employees to claim discrimination for the same identical acts that took place with white employees. We'll touch on that a little bit more in a little bit, but that's going to be it for Mr. Thompson. Like I said, he's now with State Police. The feature witness from Friday was Miss Lori Claiborne. She is now with the State Fire Marshal's Office. She had been with ATC for 8 years. For a couple of years, she worked in the New Orleans division of ATC under Brett Tingle. She did undercover narcotics buys. Now, as part of this old FDA thing, she ended up having to do compliance as well, and they were having her, or she was being asked to go into with her uniform on in the same place where she had done some undercover work, and that was deemed to be placing her safety in jeopardy, and it caused a problem, I'll put it that way. And I'm going to just say this. I believe that the plaintiffs, I try to be fair in everything, and I mean, they have just absolutely been shut out in this football game. I've previously said 70-0. this is one time that I think they did get a very small score. She testified that there was a meeting held about resolving this issue about her safety, and there were 4 employees in the meeting. And once the meeting concluded, she said she went to lunch with 2 of the employees. And she said during that lunch that she was offered a promotion if she would state that it was Brett Tingle who had placed her in that potentially dangerous situation rather than Troy Hebert. I didn't hear anything that was effectively brought out by the defense team to walk that back, and so I think most people probably did perhaps believe that was an accurate testimony. It's supposed to be, you're under oath. So, but at any rate, that is one of the very few times that I thought the plaintiff scored. So if you want to consider that a field goal, we're at 70-3. Importantly, though, she was asked, well, do you feel that Troy Hebert put you in this potentially dangerous situation because of your race? And this is her response. She said, no. It wasn't because of my race. It was out of pure ignorance. She said, I think Commissioner Hebert is completely ignorant of law enforcement. And then she made what I think was probably one of the best quotes of the trial. She said, quote, I find that common sense is not always all that common, unquote. While she was on the stand, she was asked about Mr. Tingle's use of the N-word. And I'm just going to say this, boy, did she downplay it all. Look, it's no big deal. The word doesn't have the shock value it once did. I mean, it's in rap music all the time now, and it's just kind of become, especially when we're out there on the street, just like, hey, man, it's just the lingo, it's no big deal. And I'm over. She didn't move her shoulders around and do like I'm doing. I get to ad-lib a little that she didn't have the liberty to do. But you get my point, is that, hey, if you want to be part of it, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's just, no, the N-word's no big deal. It's all in this rap and whatnot. Now, when she was placed on cross-examination, that's where things got a little bit more interesting. And she testified that in 2012, there was a meeting held in Art Smith's office, Art Smith being the plaintiff's attorney, and there were 5 or 6 ATC agents present in this meeting. In fact, I wrote them down, and I'm going to call them out now. There was Mr. Tingle, and there was a gentleman named Jed Falk. Now, Mr. Falk is also a Caucasian gentleman. He is now with the Attorney General's office. He gave testimony in the trial. I was not there for that testimony. I do know that Renee Collada, when she later was, she's one of the ATC attorneys, was examining one of the witnesses or questioning one of the witnesses. She made it a point to say, we certainly heard Mr. Falk give us an absolute earful about Troy Hebert. So, and I want to emphasize this, I was not there to see it, but I'm told that, and I trust this source for reasons that I won't go into, but as Mr. Falk exited the federal courtroom, I'm told he made a gesture toward Troy Hebert that I guess it's probably good maybe the judge didn't see it. So, Attorney General Landry, if you happen to tune in, I think you might better advise Mr. Falk to perhaps get a little bit better control of his own issues in that regard. I'll let it go at that because I was not there to see it. So we had Brett Tingle, we had Jed Falk, we had Wade Guitro. Remember, I told you that Mr. Guitro was one that I didn't remember his first name, and I got it wrong. I think I had said Chris, but anyway, Wade Guitro was in on this meeting. He was one of the ones that was only given 2 days, whereas Charles Gilmore was given 2 weeks, and Wade Guitro, for the record, is white, so Mr. Gilmore says none of that matters. That man had it in for me. We'll get to that in a moment too. So Denitra King was another one in there. Now it's interesting that Mr. Tingle would bring her into this meeting, and let's rally the troops here, and let's go after Mr. Hebert, because you may have seen in a previous exhibit that I gave you, go back to the first feature if you didn't, that he referred to Ms. King as a, quote, stupid bee. So it's ironic that, when you need to use her, you're doing so, but your sentiments of her weren't all that great. Same thing for I believe, Hingle. He, made some commentary about him, but I won't get off on all of that. And then there was Lewis Thompson. Well, I just mentioned him as he was the very first witness. Now, importantly in there, during that meeting, Brett Tingle went out of his way to say, hey, look, I've got a recording of Commissioner Hebert using racial epithets. And boy, then all of a sudden, Miss Claiborne thought that was a big deal, okay? Not all, it's just when Mr. Tingle, you know, a little bit of rap going on, all right, we got to, you know, you went to part of the clique, yeah, all right, you know, but when Mr. Hebert was said that when Tingle represented that he had a recording of Mr. Hebert using racial epithets, well, that's completely unacceptable. All right, and she did, Renee Collada questioned her. She was the one who did the cross, Renee Collada was. And she did pin her down that use of the N-word is unacceptable. She pretty much had to say that because she had said it previously in a deposition, and Miss Collada was bringing it out. But I want to emphasize, Miss Collada asked her, well, have you ever heard this recording? She readily said she had not, okay? Well, and that the recording was never played. Well, I'm here to tell you it was played in the courtroom. I told you about it on our previous feature, and there can be no question that Troy Hebert let loose with some profanity because he had been baited, you know, when he was told that the response of agents out there, which we don't even know. We're having to go on Brett Tingle's word that these agents called in left and right and said, what kind of an effing operation are you running? As you have seen, or as you're gradually seeing, Brett Tingle's mouth is no prayer book, okay, beyond just his racial tendencies and beyond his enjoyment putting sexual escapades or fantasies, well, we'll let it go with that. My point is, we got no way of knowing whether these agents even really called in with these kind of commentary. But once Tingle represented that they did and said they were asking, quote, what kind of an effing operation are you running? As I said, that's like pouring gasoline on a fire. And it did rile Troy Hebert up. And I'll be frank with you, I don't think I would have taken too kindly to it either. Miss Claiborne was asked, you may remember bear with me here, I'm looking for a sheet of paper. Here it is. Miss Claiborne was asked about, if you go back and look at the, well, you won't have to because we're going to isolate it for you. We're going to isolate to you a little bit of sexting going on here on the text messages, and she was asked about the appropriateness of this given that Mr. Tingle is her supervisor, and I'm going to take the time to read it. I don't see why we shouldn't. It's not, you know, this part I don't think is all that X-rated, but at any rate, let's read it off. It's right below the video. On June the 9th, 2012, in a text message on your ATC-issued cell phone with your subordinate, Lori Claiborne, discussing her request for sick leave, you stated, quote, no problem, just notify Jeff. I'm in Mobile. Hope you feel better. Get Lex, that would be her husband presumably, get Lex to perform some oral stimulation on you, in other words, oral sex. That always helps Tracy on a rainy day. You then further stated to her, quote, I feel you. If I had something attached to my uterus, I would pass as well. She did admit that that type of texting was quite likely inappropriate on the part of a supervisor. So, but here's where things got a little interesting, and that resulted in the title of our feature. Miss Collada gently said, well, do you have a boyfriend? And obviously, Claiborne knew where she was going, and she said, yes, I have a boyfriend. And said, well, he happens to be the chief of a metropolitan police department, does he not? He is the chief of he is the chief of the police department. Would you mind telling the court which one? My boyfriend is Murphy Paul. He's the chief of police for the city of Baton Rouge. Oh, well, let me ask you this. You've heard the text, and you've stated the context you deem it in one situation versus the other. Would you hesitate to recommend Brett Tingle to Murphy Paul to be hired on the Baton Rouge Police Department? And she said she would not hesitate for a second, okay? You've seen what Brett Tingle has texted, and this woman is stating she wouldn't hesitate to recommend to her boyfriend, Murphy Paul, that he be hired for the Baton Rouge Police Department. Let me suggest to you, Miss Claiborne, you may want to bounce that off of a gentleman named Gary Chambers, but not just him. but I think he will probably have a little bit of a difference of opinion on you with that, okay? And I know Mayor Broom would have a difference of opinion on you with that. And I'm going to tell you something else. I think you would see massive demonstrations, and it most certainly would not be just from African Americans with that little recommendation that you so readily admitted that you would make to your boyfriend, Murphy Paul. Be interesting to see what Murphy Paul himself. Murphy Paul, let me just say this, you can see it in a previous feature. He said, I support Colonel Reeves 100% on this upcoming, well, the hearing is taking place. They'll give the results on August the 9th, and we will certainly be there, you know, but he says, I fully support Colonel Reeves. I don't believe Colonel Reeves would be supportive of hiring a trooper. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and go out on a limb. I know he wouldn't, okay, that it made these kind of texts. And given that Murphy Paul seems to have admiration for Colonel Reeves, you would figure that he would not deviate from him in that regard. All right, so bottom line, Miss Claiborne would have no qualms recommending Brett Tingle for the Baton Rouge Police Department. Lord, we'll stop. The next witness, I may not have them in the right order, but Tracy Tingle. I'm going to spend no time with her because that became a non-event. She was called for direct examination. Showed the most despondent mood possible and said, look, this is not who we are, and you know, I mean, it's just not who we are. And she talked about how, you know, this had led to such heartache for her and her husband and so forth, and don't want to go to restaurants anymore, and you know, she says he's got a job installing poos, but it's just a job. He doesn't really like, that's not where his passion is. Well, given that the portrayal is made that literally your occupation in law enforcement is just like a family member, next time treat your family member with a little more respect would be mine. If you ever have that opportunity, and I don't think you're ever going to have the opportunity, you certainly should not be in law enforcement. Next up was Troy Hebert. He basically said, look, I was born in I was raised in an orphanage in Shreveport. He said, I was fortunate enough to be adopted by some fantastic parents, and you know, was in Jeanerette, a little town of 4,000 folk. I do want to pause for just a moment because he was asked about the Gilmore situation, and I just want to say this. I gave you a little bit of what Gilmore said the other day, and well, basically I said his testimony came across as very arrogant, condescending, and I gave you a little bit of it was beyond. Man, I don't have time enough to sit up here and tell this jury all the different ways that Troy Hebert had it in for me. And let me tell you, he had it in for me. I know he did because Brett Thompson told me he did. And see, that's one of the problems of this whole case. Everybody is putting their faith and trust in Brett Tingle. All right, and you've seen what kind of a person he is. You've seen the kind of representations that he has made. There were no racial epithets on that tape, okay? And so what all else has he represented? Because you never got it from the horse's mouth, okay? Every bit of this has come from Brett Tingle. Now, we'll get to more of that in a moment. But Tingle was asked, well, did Commissioner Hebert not take you to the legislature one day and introduce you to many of his former colleagues? And yeah, he did that. He dressed me up like his little token, took me all around. This is what the man said. You can get a transcript. Dressed me up like his little token, took me all around. I didn't need him to do that. I'd already told him what close friends I am with Mayor Heldon. Hell, I knew most of the, well, he didn't say hell. I knew most of those legislators before he ever took me up there. You know, he's going to dress me up in a nice suit and take me up there, you know, as his little token to go around for the legislature. He did that with all of us, you know, going to parade around. Look, it makes it very unfortunate, in my opinion, that the state settled a racial discrimination suit involving him. There's 3 others, and the state paid $250,000. If that was the type testimony he was going to give, I don't think it would have. I don't think they were very, very fortunate to get the $250,000. Let me put it that way. But at any rate, that will clarify a little bit more of the Gilmore testimony. Now, I want to take that pretty much wraps it up for Friday, but I want to take just a moment to go back and cover a few more things that I failed to mention on installment 2. One of which I told you about the secret recording of Commissioner Hebert by Brett Tingle. And, you know, while it is true that it is not against the law to do that as long as one party has notice of it, I failed to mention, and it's a very important fact, that there was an ATC policy that strictly prohibited it unless you had gotten prior approval. And don't forget, Commissioner Hebert, he had let him know in advance that, hey, we believe Keith Bernard is maybe a very well audio tape you, and you know, he wound up resigning, but yet he saw fit, despite what this policy says, to turn around and himself do it. All right, and so they ask about, well, what about your violation of the policy? He said he didn't know that was the policy. All right, and that's going to bring me to one of the expert witness that was brought in, and I hope I pronounced his name right. It's Ronald Serpas, S-E-R-P-A-S, former New Orleans police chief, also had been a police chief in the state of Washington and Tennessee, and I believe he's a PhD at Loyola. So he was an expert witness. He's been in the whole trial, and briefly, basically, he said that, look, ignorance of that policy is no excuse. You're one of the ones that they would come to know the policy, and here you are not knowing it. Now, he gave very effective expert testimony. I'm going to just hit some of the very brief high points. The ATC was well within its rights to search this phone. It was what you called an administrative search. It was not a criminal search. And he actually faulted the ATC because despite Mr. Smith, you know, prying out of Mr. Brett Tingle, every now and then I have a brain freeze that, well, you gave your full cooperation on surrendering the phone, didn't you? Well, it turns out it took them 2 years to get the phone. And Mr. Serpas, forgive me if I'm pronouncing that name wrong, but he said the ATC dropped the ball there. There's no way that phone should have been allowed to be out there in limbo for 2 years. He also went into some detail about how very clear breaking of the chain of command, insubordination. I'm not going to go into all of it because it's frickin' obvious. See, I used frickin', and so did Troy Hebert, I might add, numerous times in that tape. Now, he did also use MF several times, but I mean, it's so obvious that Tingle engaged in all these things that I'm just not going to go through them all. I will say one thing. Upon cross-examination, he was asked if he was paid. Well, common sense would dictate he is. Typically an expert witness is. And he was asked by the plaintiff's attorney, well, how much were you paid? And he said, up to the point of this trial, and he said between $16,000 and $17,000. And then they asked, well, what's your hourly rate for this trial? And he said $350 an hour. Well, you know, Mr. Gilmore, who's no longer a potential witness, has now chose to avail himself of sitting in the courtroom, and he sat right in front of the row in front of me, and boy, he started shaking his head when he heard that $17,000 and $350 an hour, and he turned around and spoke to the young lady to my right. He said, can you believe that $17,350 an hour, and every bit of it state money? Well, you know, when I threw out the first article and I said $100,000 plus, I was probably being pretty conservative, and I knew that I was, but I didn't want anybody to come in there and tell me I was exaggerating, because this is just one expert witness. He was there the whole week, so you can say 30 times 350, you know, that's another 10 grand, so it was about 30 grand for this one expert witness. And let me tell you something, I don't like paying unnecessary taxes. Tell me what to write the check for, because this kind of garbage has got to come to a stop, okay? So, but yes, litigation costs money, Mr. Gilmore. In fact, Mr. Smith had, no doubt, quite a bit of out-of-pocket outlay of his own. We know he paid $4,000 for the expert psychiatrist that came in there. But at any rate, Mr. Gilmore chose to comment on the fees for this expert witness. I know it's getting rather dark out, and I'm going to wrap this up very quickly. I praised Mr. Conkey, and there was one thing I left out, and I feel just compelled to get this in because I feel it was such an excellent maneuver as he was questioning Tingle, and we're talking about the OIG and turning him in the OIG for criminal stuff, turning him in for the FBI. Well, at one point, Mr. Conkey said, now, when you were busy reporting Mr. Hebert, boy, that was utterly brilliant. It all happened so fast, and yet he got those words ratting out. And of course, he very quickly changed it to reporting. Well, there was no time. There's no time for the plaintiff's attorneys to even object, you know. And of course, he would change the wording if they had have objected, but it all happened so fast. What an incredible way to get those words ratting out into the jury's mind with regard to this. And in reality, that's exactly what Brett Tingle was doing. I'll just very briefly, I told you about the GPS putting on the employees. It was asked early on of Hebert, well, Brett Tingle was part of that, wasn't he? As in part of putting on the GPS. And Tingle had said, I'm sorry, Hebert had said, I guess you could look at it that way. He was one of the ones that we put the GPS on. Well, the results of the GPS showed that on 35 out of the 55 days that he was under monitoring, his car never moved, okay? And Rob Chadwick, who was with the Inspector General's office, who had testified, when they said, look, we can't find sufficient evidence to proceed with a payroll fraud criminal charges, he asked how Mr. Hebert's reaction to that, and let's just say he said he was not happy, all right? And then this will be the final thing, and I know it's getting very dark. I'll see if I can't, might get a little more light going this way. When the plaintiff side rested its case, there was obviously a fully expected motion to basically declare the equivalent of a directed verdict that just failed miserably to show any cause. That is an extremely high burden to meet, and most judges are going to be very reluctant to grant that, and it was denied. But I want to bring out Josh Lee, who is the other attorney for the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission. He used some words in there that have been on my brain, and the first time I've heard it uttered, other than it might have been uttered in opening arguments, because I did not catch opening arguments. But ever since I've been in this trial, these words, they've been on my mind, okay? And he did it very briefly, and I believe it's probably going to be more focused on in the closing arguments. But he said what in trying to get the justification on granting this motion, he said, look, it was very clear that what Mr. Tingle did was, quote, play both ends against the middle. That's what happened here, folks, okay? You know, he's trying to be everybody's little pal, you know, of the black agents. He's stabbing Troy Hebert in the back. There can be no doubt whatsoever about that. And, you know, Art Smith said, well, what was his motivation? I mean, what incentive did he have to assist these black employees with their EEOC claims? Do you get some idea of why it took 4 days for Art to do his case? Because that was the kind of way and you know, he's posing the rhetorical question, well, what was his incentive to assist these black employees? And, you know, Art, if you happen to watch this, and you probably won't, but if you do, let me just say this. It's either one of two things. Either you are playing dumb, or you really are dumb, okay? Because if you cannot make the connection of what has transpired here, and that is Brett Tingle had his eye on the big prize, okay? He wanted to hit it out of the park. And I'm not talking about just getting, you know, helping them out with some settlement. This man wanted to be the next commissioner, okay? And he probably felt quite frustrated or angry even that here's Troy Hebert, who readily admits, I don't have law enforcement experience and I have to count on, that's why I rely so heavily on top lieutenants who do. And it is very obvious that he was doing everything he could to sabotage Hebert, get him knocked out, and then, logically, since he's been his right-hand man, and he will have also been the savior, getting all of this discrimination, put that in quotes, that was going on in this office, getting it nipped in the bud. And you have to remember, please don't forget this, during that time frame, I know it seems ridiculous, but Bobby Jindal's team actually believed they could be a viable candidate. He could be a viable candidate for the Republican nomination for president, okay? I know it seems ludicrous now. It should have seemed ludicrous, well, it did to most people even back then, but not to these folk. So the point is, with them believing that they could realistically do that, how bad is it going to look that you've got some major discrimination going on with the black folk? So if Tingle could pull this off, Well, the general administration, I got it. Troy Heber's got to go. Understand what I'm saying? You're not going to interfere with my ability to become president of the United States. Thank you so much, Brett Tingle, and we're going to have you as interim. And he ultimately, I believe it was in his mind to become the permanent. Well, when you have unbridled ambitions such as that, oftentimes it can lead you where you are. And I'm sure he will be quite frustrated when this is all over, when all of those he assisted all got some money and he got a goose egg. This is Robert Burns. Thank you so much for having tuned in. I apologize that it got dark on you. I don't have the greatest face in the world. We all know it, so you probably said it's an improvement. Thank you once again. We'll update this feature to give you the jury's verdict. We'll have another, we'll be in Monroe on Thursday for the State Police Commission meeting hearing, where they have told us at least they will render their decision on the Vegas crew. Thank you once again for all of your dedication. I apologize. Last time I was basically having to improvise for the sun. This time it's because it's pretty doggone dark. But again, it spared you from seeing my face, and I'm sure many of you are saying, thank God it got dark. Thank you again, and we will have this next upcoming feature for you in coming days. Thank you again.